In between our Monster Manual entries, I like to look at other aspects of the Forgotten Realms. And lately we've been going over some of the more vile villains in the realms, and perhaps even outside of the realms. We've covered a few types of celestial beings before, but surely there are devils too. Where do the more evil souls go when they pass from the living? Surely there's a hell, right? Well, what if I told you there are 9 of them? Today we're going to cover Beator, the 9 hells, and we're going to get familiar with each one of them. This entry is not going to get into the weeds for each layer, but we'll learn enough information to be able to identify each layer based on its geography. And later on we'll dive deeper into each of the layers and perhaps look at the governments and politics of each one. So equip that ring of fire resistance, pray to whichever god you deem fit, and let's dive into the first layer of the 9 hells, Avernus. Avernus acts as the primary battleground of the Blood War, where legions of devils march across its plains in continual readiness to repel the hordes of demon invaders that sail the river Styx into Avernus. As a matter of fact, the river Styx runs through all of the lower plains, with a number of offshoots and falls. Lakes and streams flow across Avernus's plains and feed into the Styx. Avernus is the largest of the 9 hells and the most traditionally infernal. It's what one might consider a stereotypical hell, with a blasted landscape, rivers of lava, barren hills, and red rocky mountains as far as the eye can see. In fact, to scale these mountains is quite unwise, as you'll find jagged obsidian, quartz, and other crystals jutting up from the ground, making it rather easy for them to slash clothing and flesh alike. The rather ubiquitous presence of rocks and boulders, some of which seem to resemble tormented faces and shapes of creatures, render the terrain extremely treacherous and difficult to cross at any pace quicker than a brisk walk. And if you look skyward, you'll see fireballs racing across the dark expanse, crashing to the ground, leaving smoking impact craters and burnt corpses in their wake. So if you ever find yourself unlucky enough to be traversing Avernus, be on the lookout for shelter lest you be struck down. The land is filled with acrid air, clouded with pumice and volcanic ash amongst the swarms of flies as well. Blood, as it would happen, appears to be the motif of Avernus, especially where the river Styx runs through the plain, collecting in rivulets from every gulch, stream, and pool from the victims of millions of battles throughout its history. Practically the entire plain is bathed in a coat of blood and covered with bones and gore, whether devilish, demonic, or otherwise, acting as a grim reminder of the routine bloodshed that marks an average day in Avernus. And off in the distance, the Bronze Citadel, a huge fortress city dozens of square miles in extent and ringed by 12 heavily defended walls. A brutish, unimaginative city bristling with war machines. A city filled with petitioners, both lemures and soul shells, and hundreds of thousands of lesser devils of all types bound for the front lines of the Blood War. But you know, I think that's a tale for another time. Continuing down the river Styx, we'll eventually enter Dis, the second layer of the 9 hells. Dis is a flat and barren plain containing little more than black, stagnant rivers stretching for thousands of miles, perhaps stretching out infinitely for all we know. The sky is a cloudy, dull green accentuated with cracks of lightning from time to time. But Dis's main attraction, as it were, is the city of the same name, the Iron City of Dis. Appearing in a valley surrounded by a ring of spiked mountains, Dis seems to take up nearly the entire plain on its own. From what I've read, the lair and the city were practically indistinguishable. The city rises starkly from the blasted landscape several miles in height and off into the distance nearly as far as the eye can see. Foul rivers radiate from a moat big enough to be called a lake surrounding the Iron City. The walls of the interior buildings and the stones of the streets glow the dull red of hot iron. As a matter of fact, more than brief skin contact results in severe burns. The streets of the Iron City are always crowded with parading devil nobles and workers that are constantly remodeling the city. The most numerous inhabitants are Abishai, imps, and lemures, but also shades and other planar creatures can be found. Prisoners of war, tormented underlings, and kidnapped victims are kept in decrepit underground dungeons where their wails of woe can be heard filtering up through small vents in the iron walls. And above it all rises the Iron Tower where the Master of Dis sits and schemes, untouchable to those below. But we'll take a look at Despater in another entry. For now, our tour continues with the third layer of the 9 hells. Minauros is an endless bog of vile pollution, decaying bodies, and rotting marsh. A land repeatedly drenched by rain, sleet, and even hailstorms. The soggy, bone-strewn, disease-ridden swampland makes movement incredibly difficult and is only broken occasionally by serpentine ridges of volcanic rock. The swamp exudes a luminescent mist, however, that does provide some illumination. Temperatures vary enormously throughout the lair. Some areas are cold enough to freeze the bog over, while others boil under intense heat, even forming vast mud geysers. The polluted swamp extends endlessly into the distance, but at one point you'll find the city of Minauros, a settlement and the seat of power for Mammon, the Lord of the Third. A constantly sinking city with black muck oozing up from between the paving stones. Streets buckle and shift from time to time as entire buildings vanish into the slime below. I've read that periodically expeditions of petitioners and slaves are sent to fetch volcanic rock to shore up the city and replace portions of its streets. The primary inhabitants of Minauros appear to be bearded devils, chain devils, imps, and spine devils. However, also quite common are the barbed devils, who are charged with tracking and hunting down the slaves attempting to escape. But for now, we continue on down the river Styx into the fourth lair of the Nine Hells, Phlegethos. Phlegethos is actually surprisingly similar to Avernus in that, at first glance, it resembles more of the stereotypical hells one might imagine while closing one's eyes. A fiery world of eternal damnation filled with active volcanoes, rivers of liquid fire, molten rock, ash hills, smoking pits, all racked with tremors and earthquakes. Even the air seems aflame, so one might liken it to the elemental plane of fire. The scorching heat that ignites the air itself appears to create seemingly sentient and aggressive flames that leap at visitors but not at its residents. The ground has fissures that spew jets of flame that flow on into the rivers of liquid fire, eventually culminating in the Pit of Flame. A place of pain and punishment, the Pit of Flame is the volcanic center of Phlegethos, a massive lake of boiling filth that jettisons columns of white flame hundreds of feet into the air. At first glance, one might think this is harmless to the devils, as most, if not all of which are immune to fire, but not even devils can endure the agonizing flames of the pit. Reason being, the flames are not ordinary fire, but a specific type called hellfire. A fire of unspeakably hot energy that draws from the hells themselves, that causes even those normally immune to extreme heat to writhe and convulse in unimaginable torment. And then, looking up, suspended above the columns, are iron balls held in place by huge cantilevered beams in which various devils are kept. This is where the higher echelons of devils can condemn other devils that break Beatorian law. In fact, it's said that Asmodeus himself is known to send those who provoke his ire to years of torture in the Pit of Flame. But, my dear friends, let's keep moving. We have much to see. Stygia, the polar opposite of the land of Phlegethos. Stygia is a vast frozen sea dominated by ice floes and icebergs. A saltwater plain that's almost completely frozen, its dark depths extend endlessly down below. Some of the ice floes are large enough to even support cities, in fact. Navigation between these settlements is made surprisingly easy due to the presence of the Styx, which cuts through the ice, creating a kind of channel. Small Arctic plants even grow in a few locations, creating vast icy swamps that are just slightly warmer than the rest of the lair. These areas attract several creatures and wildlife, but are at large risk of the thinner ice breaking, of course. The sky of Stygia is in a state of perpetual twilight and is constantly struck by lightning, making it nearly impossible for flying creatures to traverse. Stygia is practically unique among the lairs of the Nine Hells in that it's almost entirely untamed and wild, and therefore unexplored. No significant part of its territory is devoted to any particular purpose, and for that reason its wilderness is inhabited by several aggressive creatures like direwolves, frostworms, and krakens. In fact, the creatures are commonly used as training for devils in the military. Stygia is even rumored to have been originally a world in the prime material plane that was doomed to destruction. It's said the inhabitants pledged their entire world and their souls to Asmodeus in exchange for safety. However, that's neither here nor there. Let's move on to the next layer. Malbolge is the sixth layer of this damned plane. Malbolge is a gargantuan tumble of angular black stone rocks, with each one ranging in size from a small city to a large metropolis. These blocks can be literally hundreds of miles thick. The randomly tilted and ill-fitting blocks are honeycombed with angular passages and caverns, causing non-flyers to frequently need mountaineering skills to traverse them. Stinking clouds of vapor rise up from the depths and light the sky with the color of blood. Some say that due to this color, these titanic blocks in Malbolge actually rest on an infinite sea of lava. As a matter of fact, I've heard corroborating reports that flammable materials left on the ground for a short time will spontaneously combust. Jutting up from the ground in the distance, you see Osea, the fortress of Glacia, the master of this land and actual daughter of Asmodeus. I've read that the fortress is quite literally constructed from the skull of the plane's former owner, Malgard, the Hag Countess. It sits right outside of the Hair Forest and is apparently constantly being remodeled as Glacia upgrades and refurbishes it. Among other vacation locations, you have the Lake of Bile, a group of vile toxic lakes, and Magath Tig, a mysterious cavern located at the bottom of one of the many rocky slopes of Malbolge that even devils are terrified of entering. But we aren't on that kind of trip. We need to move on to the 7th layer. Maladomini is an endless, infinite field of ruined and decaying cities and the center for all the bureaucracy of the Nine Hells. The landscape is dotted with abandoned cities serving as shelters and hideouts for runaway petitioners, deserters, criminals, and other lost beings. Between the cities, the layer is marked by surface mines, deforested areas, and clogged canals. And a black ichor also appears to exude from all matter in the layer. The layer's sky is a shade of black that's reminiscent of Venus blood. The lakes snaking through the landscape are almost completely covered in sludge, and some areas contain sentient pieces of polluted matter that reaches and grasps before dying in the toxic atmosphere. The very few remaining forests are either in a state of rotting or spontaneously combusting. The Lord of the Seventh was never satisfied with the construction of his capital and repeatedly built and abandoned city after city. The largest and most beautiful is Malagard, a sprawling metropolis with myriad black towers linked by a tangled web of bridges and walkways. Malagard is rumored to contain 1,000,000 rooms and to cap an equally complex dungeon labyrinth. You know, it's said that Maladomini was once a beautiful and fully urbanized realm. However, its master at the time attempted to overthrow Asmodeus by forging and altering records in an attempt to frame him as an incompetent leader. He then organized an attack on Nessus to replace Asmodeus before he could respond. However, a massive offensive by demons of the Abyss thundered across Avernus just as he was about to enact his plan. This caused a sort of domino effect and in the end completely laid his plans bare for Asmodeus to see. Maladomini was then ravaged by attacks from the other Lords of the Nine, which ultimately defeated the defending forces and reduced the lair to a ravaged wasteland. But politics are of no matter in this entry. We continue forth to the 8th lair, Cania. Someone said that not all hells are places of fire, and the 8th lair is the perfect example. This lair is a land of relentless living cold. It's marked by moving glaciers and icebergs that drift as fast as a running person, constantly colliding with one another and surrounded by mountains of enormous sizes. Cania is a land dominated by violent snow avalanches and snowstorms that howl with incessant winds. Thin layers of accumulated snow often hide deep crevasses that can engulf incautious explorers. The supernatural cold of Cania is substantially stronger than in Stygia, reaching temperatures of -60 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a cold that can quickly penetrate non-magical clothing, freezing unprotected creatures within mere minutes and killing even those wearing gear designed for cold in hours. Unsheltered creatures run a constant risk of freezing to death, so one can find preserved corpses littering the ground throughout the lair. In fact, some of the creatures frozen in the glacial ice in Cania appear to be either archons or divas fighting unknown spined creatures. I've read accounts that even claim to have seen entire alien cities frozen in the vast icebergs. But even with all that, the lair contains scattered laboratories and libraries within isolated citadels, perhaps owned by the Lord of the Eighth, Mephistopheles. Beyond that, there aren't any main inhabitants of Cania due to the land being so incredibly inhospitable. So let's leave this frigid wasteland and keep moving. We don't have much further to go. This is Nessus, the 9th lair. Nessus is a featureless plain with jagged edges that extend 2,500 miles from east to west and 1,100 miles from north to south, floating within an endless red void. The plains are scarred by chasms and ravines several thousand miles deep and frequently ravaged by fiery storm winds. The river Styx, the very same one on which we started our journey, trickles down into Nessus through a little-known small offshoot. It's a heavily guarded area patrolled by devils who will slay a trespasser on sight. The river drains into a shallow pool known as the Forgotten Lake, collecting at the bottom before continuing on to its other destinations. Looking out over the featureless plain, one can see the city of Malbolge. Malbolge is the largest city in all of the Outer Plains and home to Asmodeus, supreme master of the 9 hells and lord of Nessus. A city inhabited by millions and millions of devils being held in reserve for a seemingly unknown cataclysmic battle. But continuing on down into the depths of Nessus, there's a place known only as the Serpent's Coil. A place so far from anything one might consider divine, a place completely separated from even the rest of the 9 hells. The coil is the deepest rift of the lair and is said to have been blasted into the landscape as a result of Asmodeus' fall into the hells. A descent many millennia ago when he was ejected from the heavens. It's said that the Serpent's Coil is the home of his true form and where he resides, licking the wounds sustained during that fall. But whether or not this is accurate, no one can say, for Asmodeus goes out of his way to present lies as truth as often as possible. He even presents himself as a tall, slender man with horns protruding from his forehead and a handsome face, but I've heard his secret form is much, much more hideous. However, maybe we can cover this in a future entry. We've completed what we've come here to do, and I think it might be time to leave this place, even if we're only exploring it in our imaginations. Because one never knows how devils might work their way into one's mind after all. Okay guys, this was a long one, and I feel like I barely touched on anything. I hope that now you've listened to this entry, you can at least tell the difference between Avernus and Stygia. I think further down the line, each of these locations and their masters could get their own entry. But anyways, this is your guide signing out. Be safe, take care, and happy trails.